So I'm glad that we got to start with just a little bit of stillness and silence, even though I was talking a little bit. It's nice to start satsang with a dropping into that place where the mind can slow down and where the sense of awareness actually gets to take center stage for once. Just to remind us that that's what satsang is about. That all the words are actually completely relevant to the stillness that is below all of the words. Now, I talk a lot, and so I say that it's nice to start with the stillness, just in case anyone finds themselves grabbing hold of what's said and forgetting that it's actually about stillness and silence. A stillness and silence that can be there while we live life, going about our business, doing whatever needs to be done. And so obviously it doesn't talk about a physical stillness of the body. It's really a stillness of the thinking mind, the part of the brain that produces a whole lot of suffering, psychological suffering. It doesn't even mean the end of thinking per se. Thinking is a very valid part of the human experience. If anyone made the mistake of wishing for their thinking to stop, they would be very disappointed if that wish got delivered. Because you'd find yourself stuck in whatever spot that wish happened to be delivered in, and you would die. So thinking is actually very valuable. And the thinking I'm talking about here is the thinking of the working mind versus the thinking of the thinking mind, which can fall away, never to arise again. And so if the thinking of the thinking mind falls away, we find ourselves living life more or less as we did before. When we start to look at it, biologically speaking, the body will still move in the way that it is designed to move. It's always been moving the way it's designed to move. It moves towards its biological preferences and away from its biological non-preferences. And the thinking mind was a whole layer of additional thinking towards what is happening in the flow of life. And the thinking mind can come to an end because it's based on a set of deeply ingrained beliefs that life has put in place. Beliefs that are triggered by the flow of life, that seem to impact the beliefs in a way that are received as an attack on who I am. So this deeply ingrained set of beliefs essentially is an identity that gets formed. It's a belief about who I am. And beliefs, actually, when we look at them, are thoughts. They're really very intangible and fleeting, they come and go, but thought in the form of a belief is actually a concept believed to be truth. So it's related to the idea of who I am, the concept of who I am is related to as an absolute. And so it gets put in place in a way that doesn't seem fleeting and intangible. It feels very solid. And so when life unfolds as it's destined to unfold, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, the flow of life bumps into this psychological identity. An identity that says, I need love. I need life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. So that's the belief. What I am needs life to be a particular way. Pleasure, 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 pleasure. Love from the other showing me that they respect me, they understand me, they appreciate me, they care for me. And then when life unfolds inevitably, and inevitably not pleasure, 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 because the nature of the flow of life is a mix of pleasure and pain. So when life unfolds as it's destined to do, this identity that says my completeness is to be found when life is pleasure, 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 pleasure. That identity gets highly confronted by life being different. And it's forced to explode into a firework of feelings and thoughts that in essence, when we feel into them, are uncomfortable, an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. So in very simple terms, this uncomfortableness which arises whenever life unfolds out of line with what the belief identity needs. In very simple terms, this uncomfortableness is human unhappiness. So before I say anything else, there's a really important question that this set of pointers, this teaching, if you want, you can, I sometimes call it a teaching. There's a very important question that this teaching suggests that we ask ourselves. And that question is a very practical question. And the reason it asks us to ask a very practical question is because when we look at life practically, we start to get some answers. Answers that maybe we didn't have before when we weren't looking at life practically. And the reason this is because life, this experience of life and the human condition seems to be to believe things that we're told, and we believe them without actually checking it out for ourselves. So when we believe something without checking it out for ourselves, the nature of belief is that it says, this is true. And if someone says, that's not true, we go, you're wrong, this is true. That's the nature of belief. And what if we're told a whole lot of things that are not that accurate and we believe them? So the suggestion is, let's start becoming really practical about life and observing it in a way that we can observe and see what we see. And if we start seeing it for ourselves, we start putting ticks next to these concepts for ourselves, and then we can say, actually, I'm quite confident about this, not because someone told me, but because someone gave me a pointer and they said, don't believe this. This is a pointer of where to look. And the pointer stuck, a bit like it was written down on a piece of yellow sticky and we stuck it in a place where we always see it. And we use that pointer as a reminder of where to look. And so we say, I'm pretty sure about this now, not because someone told me, but because someone suggested I have a look, under the cover. And I had a look under the cover and I saw what was there. And so if someone tells me, hey, you're saying that that's under the cover and it's not, I go, I'm pretty sure it is, because I've been looking there. And I didn't see it before. I didn't see it because I didn't look. In fact, I believed what you're telling me before, because that's what life tends to tell us. And then at some point, life comes along and says, hey, here's some new information. Take a look. So the teaching is a set of concepts, and it encourages us really. The deepening of the understanding happens when we look for ourselves at what is being pointed at. And you'll see shortly that I'll throw out lots and lots of concepts. Everything that's mentioned here is mentioned because it's particularly relevant to one subject only. So the talks are about one subject only. I think it's really important to say that so we don't end up losing focus and talking about another subject. The subject is happiness for the human being in daily living. If someone's here to learn how to make a great spaghetti bolognese, it's not the right place. But if people are interested in happiness in daily living, then this is a good place to be. I speak from my own direct experience, so you're welcome to question that. Don't just believe it either. Right? But I tell you sincerely that the reason that I feel or that I'm passionate about this is because life delivered this information. The information was part of a process of radical change where what was delivered in practical terms, lots of things delivered along the way in terms of insights and realizations. But what was delivered in practical terms is the end of suffering. Or what I call in this teaching, and this is a teaching that Ramesh shared with seekers for many years out of his home in Mumbai. Ramesh was my teacher at the end of this phase. And so in practical terms, it delivers the end of suffering, and in this teaching, the end of suffering is what is called human happiness. Happiness for the human being, if we put a description on it in practical terms, is actually just the end of suffering. And it's available on a continuous, unbroken basis, regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in, for a very particular reason. One way of explaining the particular reason why happiness on a continuous, unbroken basis is available, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in, is because of what we are at our core. The essence of the human being is something very, very particular. It is what it is. And what it is complete, self-content, self-confirming, and untouched by the flow of life. It isn't added to or subtracted from by what happens in the flow of life. The reason that the flow of life has such an effect on the experience is because this belief of who we are exists. And so the belief of who we are, which becomes a sort of psychological construct, sort of sits on top of our true nature and says, hey, I'm the one that's living life. And so the experience is a life that is lived by this psychological identity, a set of beliefs. So the reason that continuous unbroken peace of mind is our birthright, everyone's birthright, is because the essence of the human being is something very particular, something untouched by the flow of life, something that is already complete, has always been complete, will always be complete, is actually complete right now. Doesn't need to develop or to grow. Why that's not experienced is simply because there's a visitor that's taking up the master bedroom. Yes, you can say that, an intruder. So, not that I suggest a question comes at this stage, because it may be useful for me to put forward a little bit more of the framework in which maybe we should wander when we start discussing it more. So any stage someone is very welcome to ask a question, because it's being broadcast and also recorded. If you don't mind using the microphone that will be passed around to you, there's a button halfway down the microphone. If you hold it for a second, the green light will come on, and once the green light is on, you can ask away or comment away. So the other reason that continuous unbroken peace of mind is available is because suffering stems from a belief about who we are that is incorrect. Basically, an idea of who I am that is not very accurate. An idea that has been put in place by life. We can call it an error. It's inaccurate. So, that's the word I'm using, an error. In the overall scheme of things, it's exactly where it's meant to be. It's not that something has gone wrong. The error has been put in place by life in order for the experience of life to be exactly what it is. Suffering for a large part of life. So suffering seems to be very much a very valid part of the experience of life. So this error about who we are is in place, and therefore the result of that false belief is suffering, so the suffering is an error. An error stemming from an error. And when life corrects the error, which really means dissolves the false idea of who I am, then it makes sense that the error stemming from the original error, the secondary error, or the explosion of the belief into a feeling of suffering, which will describe, arises in many different forms. Once the belief is gone, then the subsequent feeling of uncomfortableness with oneself and with life goes. This is good news, incidentally. So, this very important question that I suggest is asked, and the reason it gets asked, one is that it's a good question if we're about to find ourselves seeking in life. If seeking happens, it makes sense that this question, what am I really looking for, gets asked. Imagine you get sent off on a mission to find something. Okay, the king of the land says, go out and find what I want. And the winner will get lots of land. Everyone scuttles out. They've spent their years, this is not going to be easy, so they're out there for years looking. And then one person bumps into another and goes, what are we looking for? the other person says, well, I'm just looking, don't disturb me, I'm looking. But I've been looking for a long time, but I'm not sure what I'm looking for. So if we ask this question for ourselves and really get practical about it, what am I really looking for? We might see that if we drop any ideas, any concepts that we've picked up along the way in life, concepts that family, that society, even spiritual teachings have given us, and we say, let me just drop everything for a second, and you go to your own direct knowing, and you say, actually, the reason that I put all my effort into starting up a new business is because I think that that's going to make me happy. And the reason that I'm maybe desperately seeking is because if I'm really honest, I just think that it'll make me happy. And the great news to me is that this search is actually, it's an intuitive movement. Intuitively, our true nature knows that its nature is to be happy. The problem is that the seeking for happiness has taken on some forms that instead of delivering happiness, deliver suffering. They have taken on these forms because what starts seeking for happiness is this belief system that's been put in place, who I am. So this who I am belief system has and what I need. Who I am and what I need in order to be complete. And it comes up, inherently, the identity is uncomfortable with itself because it's not what we truly are, it's just an idea. It's a belief, and it's incorrect. So what it produces is an uncomfortableness, like something's not quite right. And then it informs us of, well, this is what I am, this is what I need, so my happiness will be found out there. And it makes sense that maybe if that whole thing is an error, maybe what it's telling us about happiness is an error. So I think it's very important for us to come up with this answer, not because I say so, but because it's a pointer, it's a hint. We go, actually it's true. I just want to be happy in practical, simple terms. But I don't know what happiness is. It seems like, when we look at it, that humans have been seeking happiness in outcomes, happiness in pleasure, happiness in circumstance, and they've been struggling to get it in the future out there. So the deeply ingrained belief is that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found in life looking a certain way, pleasure, 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 this idea of how life should be. An idea that when we think about it is probably never going to happen, because life is like an avalanche coming down a mountain. It's this big movement that maybe started with an initial impulse, one way of looking at it. And here we are saying, well, I'd like life to look like this. Can you move a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right? And life, it doesn't work like that. Life's never going to be like we imagine it. We'd better start to come in line with how life is. Otherwise, we're going to be frustrated. So now we're starting to look at the core of what this belief system is. The idea that my completeness is dependent on outcomes. The belief my completeness is dependent on outcomes. And once again, look at it for ourselves. When life unfolds a certain way, what's the experience inside? What's the reaction inside? And we'll see it's a reaction of uncomfortableness with the situation that arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry or anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And so if we see that, we can draw some inferences. The inference is, wow, if this is my reaction to the flow of life when it's a certain way, maybe I do have a belief that life needs to be pleasure, 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 according to my picture of life. If I didn't have that belief, then where's this uncomfortableness in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation coming from? So we'll look at these forms of suffering, so that essentially awareness plus the working mind. Now the working mind is very different from the thinking mind. The thinking mind is what produces suffering. If we think that if we say all thinking is the problem, then I'd better not give you anything to think about. But if we create a separation between the thinking mind and the working mind, and become clear that suffering is a product of the thinking mind, and the thinking mind is where these false beliefs live. The thinking mind is these false beliefs. And the working mind it produces thinking too, but it's very functional thinking. You know, the idea about what I need to buy when I go to the shops, the thinking that says I need milk and I need carrots, and that's not suffering. It is not a problem for the human being. And here we are waiting for thinking to stop, hoping that thinking will stop. So if what I'm putting out here is grabbed by the thinking mind, then there's more fuel for the thinking mind. The thinking mind is suffering. I'm not talking to the thinking mind, I'm talking to the working mind. Now, whether the thinking mind or the working mind receives what's being said, not in our control, not in my control or your control. But the great news is that if the working mind grabs it and then the thinking mind grabs hold of it, what's going to happen is the thinking mind is going to grab hold of it and some suffering is going to happen. Maybe, for example, in the form of the thinking mind saying, now I can be happy because now I have the information, now I can go to work, now I can achieve this, I can make it happen. And if that's the case, it's because the mind hasn't actually realized what information is being put forward. Eventually, the working mind will see this functioning of the thinking mind and will go, oh, that's suffering. Because we'll talk about the different forms of suffering. And so the working mind will become equipped to catch out the thinking mind. And contrary to popular belief, this process is a process of change on the level of the body and the mind. So enlightenment itself, liberation itself, is not an intellectual thing. But the way that comes about, the process of enlightenment, is completely intellectual. Now, it's very easy for that to go overlooked, to be unseen, that that the process is intellectual. Especially if we're told that enlightenment has nothing to do with the intellect. Now remember, I agree, enlightenment itself, not a result of positive thinking. But the process is completely of change on the level of the intellect. The reason being is that, according to the concepts put forward here, enlightenment is the end of suffering. That's what enlightenment delivered. Actually, Buddha said it. When I came across the teachings of Buddha, I came across it it took 2 sentences. Obviously, that's not the complete teaching. It's the condensed, very convenient version that was really important to me. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. So we're looking, so what is this? So really, enlightenment is the end of suffering. Suffering, what we're looking at, we're talking about suffering now. Suffering is based on a belief that life has inserted, life has put in place, and the belief is in the intellect, right? In the thinking mind. And the process, however it does it, in different ways, the process, whether we know it or not, slowly allows the working mind to realize the mistakes of the thinking mind. Awareness plus the working mind see the mistakes of the thinking mind. As the working mind catches out the thinking mind, it effectively reprograms what has been programmed by life. So life brings new conditioning into the working mind, saying, that sort of thinking, the thinking that blaming the other is useful, the thinking that feeling guilt and shame is useful, is actually a mistake. So once life brings about that new conditioning in the working mind sees the thinking mind blaming the other. And a thought arises, that's a waste of time. Not only is it a waste of time, that's my suffering. And with that, the blame can drop. If the working mind hasn't been conditioned to understand that blame and guilt is actually not helpful and it's actually our suffering, it carries on because the belief in the thinking mind is it is helpful. And the belief in the thinking mind is this is true. So hopefully what we can start to do in these teachings is start to see things in a way that maybe we haven't seen before. Investigate for ourselves. Is it true that as my suffering got lighter in my experience, so many people have an experience of suffering getting lighter, suffering coming to an end. They can ask themselves, is it true that in practical terms, it's the quieting down, the shutting down of a certain type of thinking? Because the beliefs on which the thinking used to arise got dissolved. And is it true that how it gets dissolved is by the brain being updated essentially with new information that makes the old way of thinking get seen as being obsolete? And the reason why this is often not pointed at is because some teachings actually have a different methodology of just shutting the mind down, the thinking mind, invalidating the thinking mind, and that makes sense. The thinking mind doesn't actually serve a very great purpose other than to cause suffering. But what tends to happen is the mind can get shut down and we can have silence, but the deeply ingrained beliefs aren't necessarily uprooted. At some point, life needs to bring in awareness about the beliefs. Otherwise, we keep getting dragged out of this silence because life impacts the belief again, and then we spend our time having to go into this, I have to go back to witnessing. And we can spend our whole time in this moving into witnessing and being dragged out of it. Why? Because the beliefs haven't actually been dissolved. And so if life brings in this approach from two angles where we start to realize there's this field of being, which is what I really am, and we find ourselves dropping into being and understanding certain things about our true nature from our own experience, then that's very valuable. And at other times, then there's an investigation of the intellect. Jnana yoga is the path of wisdom, and the way that the process of jnana yoga works is through the deliverance of concepts that talk about exactly what I'm talking about. Talk about the nature of suffering and the nature of self or happiness. So if we look at this human suffering in its 5 forms, guilt, blame and pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, we find that the first 3 forms, guilt, blame and pride, are based on a belief in personal doership. So what that means is a belief that says, what I am, so part of this identity, what I am is the doer and the other is the doer. The doer, the belief in doership, means that what is seen, what is believed, is that whatever happens through me in each moment is a result of me. If I say something, the belief in doership concludes that's me that orchestrated that. It's me that created the words. And if thinking happens, the belief in personal doership relates to the thinking as mine. Thinking is there, I must have created it. And when the body moves, the belief in personal doership relates to that as my doing. Because it happened, and well, it feels like, the experience is, it feels like me, so it must be me. So the belief in personal doership, which makes complete sense as to why it's there, because it's undeniable that the experience of life, at least on the surface, includes the feeling of free will, which means in the moment it feels like I am the body, it feels like I'm free to do whatever I want. And so because that's the experience, it makes complete sense that the belief of personal doership gets put in place. Why wouldn't it? We'll take the experience as a reflection of truth without any other information. Seems fair. So the belief in personal doership effectively sees everything that is happening in life as a result of a doer, which is an entity that upon investigation doesn't really exist. So it sees what happens through the other, not as a happening, but as their doing. Makes sense, because that's how we believe, that's how we see what's happening through this body, as my doing. And the belief is there is an entity that controls, that chooses what happens next. So with this deeply ingrained belief, so deeply ingrained that we don't know it's a belief, it doesn't get experienced as a belief, it gets experienced as me. With this deeply ingrained belief, when life unfolds in a way that is painful, and the pain is a result of what has happened through this body, and what happened through this body delivers pain to someone I love or a stranger or myself, then the subsequent thought has to be, I am the doer. What I did of my own free will, of my own volition as a separate independent entity, what I did hurt the other, hurt myself, and therefore I feel guilty and I hate myself. I hate myself for what I did. I should have and I could have done it differently. I could have done something better. This is after the fact. Once the pain has been delivered, this attitude towards what has happened exists based on the belief in personal doership. It's not an option, it has to be there. If the belief in personal doership is there, a reaction from that belief in personal doership in one form or another must arise. And so one of the forms in which it arises is guilt. Guilt for pain in the moment that unfolds according to the actions of this body, which are interpreted to be the actions of me. So guilt arises. Blame is a reaction that happens when another does something in life that delivers pain to me or someone I love. And the attitude is, you as a doer have done this. You as a doer have created this pain. Incidentally, remember, pain, which we believe is an attack on who we are, because the belief system also includes the belief that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And therefore, you as a doer should have and could have done it differently. You didn't. That's an attack on who I am, so I hate you. You hurt me, I hate you. That's blame, based on the belief in personal doership. And pride is still based on the belief in personal doership, me as a doer, but in relation to those outcomes that are positive. Outcomes that happen through this body, but deliver positive outcomes. And then we say, look what I achieved. Me as the doer, look what I did. So in practical terms, human uncomfortableness arises in the form of guilt, blame, and pride, and under each one of those is a whole host of subcategories. So in its deepest form, guilt is shame, lack of self-worth, unworthiness, insecurity, or just your common everyday guilt, for not having sent your mother a birthday card on her birthday. I forgot, and I'm such a terrible son. That feeling of not being up to scratch. Blame has all sorts of different forms: resentment, hatred, jealousy, everyday blame for the person that parked their car in front of your driveway and you can't get out. Then pride, a sense of superiority, and just generally pride's pretty self-explanatory, except the thing with pride is it's usually about things that are going well, so it can be hard to see that that is a form of suffering. Once we start becoming a little bit sensitive to this, we'll see that pride is a form of suffering. And then worry and anxiety, based on the belief that my happiness, my completeness, who I am, is dependent on outcomes. So we start getting worried about how life will turn out, because we realize life is unpredictable, uncertain, and so we start worrying about what life is going to deliver next, which will be seen or could be seen psychologically as an attack on who I am. And then expectation. Expectation is this idea that I need to get somewhere. I need something in order to be complete, still based on this, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. So we have these expectations about getting something out of something. And when the expectations aren't met, there is this, what I'm calling attachment to outcome. And the feeling inside is a feeling of being uncomfortable with the fact that the outcome isn't what we want. So if we become very clear, and remember, what are we really looking for? We're looking for human happiness. And in practical terms, human happiness is continuous unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. So that's the suggested answer about what we're looking for. Yes, we're looking for happiness, but happiness is not to be found in outcomes, not to be found in pleasure. We've been looking for it there for our whole life. Hopefully at some point the thought arises, maybe I've got it wrong. Maybe happiness isn't to be found out there. And in fact, we can see that we've been told for thousands of years, your happiness is never to be found out there. That's ignorance. Your happiness is to be found inside. And so this expectation is the expectation of finding happiness out there. So when we become familiar with all of the different forms of unhappiness, essentially, awareness starts landing on the different forms of unhappiness. And the doer inside of us hates to hear this. Everything I'm saying, the doer hates, because it's actually dismantling, these concepts are completely attacking the beliefs of doership, the false identity. So the false identity in most people, if I took an average sample of people off the streets from the supermarket and stuck them in the chairs and started talking about how actually there is a false belief of personal doership, and then here's the kicker, that life is predetermined, life unfolds moment after moment exactly as it's destined to unfold. There isn't anyone that is determining as a separate individual entity what happens next. Life is a story, a creation that is unfolding exactly according to the way it has been created. The doer inside will be firing up, saying, "This is nonsense. This isn't spirituality. Spirituality is about silence, and there's so many words here." Remember, the beginning was, let's get practical. Let's ask ourselves a question that we can answer for ourselves. What am I really looking for? If I drop and go, I just want to be happy. The only reason I'm going to these retreats is because this time when I go, something might happen and then everything will be okay. The reason that we're doing anything in life is because we just want to be happy. And I'm suggesting that that's a very, very intelligent movement, an intuitive movement. The problem is that the happiness is being sought in the wrong place. So once it becomes clear that human happiness is just the end of suffering, then the problem is seen for what it is. Awareness lands on suffering as the problem. And what starts happening if the concepts that are delivered here start to sink in? What starts happening is the suffering as it arises gets cut off. And if it doesn't get cut off, it gets witnessed. Witnessed as a happening that is part of the story of life and not my doing. So let's look at why the human being is not the doer. It's actually a really simple little exploration. When I say simple, it doesn't mean it's easy for the seeing of it to really happen, because the belief in personal doership is really quite ingrained. But if we look at what the human being is on a biological and psychological level, the human being is essentially a biological instrument that is made up of two factors, the genes and up-to-date conditioning that life has put in place. So life created a genetic structure, and then life impacted that genetic structure moment after moment after moment, what we can call conditioning. In each moment, life is delivering conditioning. And at any point in time, we can say the totality of the conditioning that has been delivered and how it has been accumulated by the genetic structure, that we can call the up-to-date conditioning. And so if you find a third factor, then this theory sort of doesn't hold true. But I suggest that if we look, we'll find that on a biological and psychological level, the human being is based on these two factors, the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Two factors we had no control over. That basically means in this moment, everyone is the way they are, one way. Really, if we could freeze frame everyone in a moment, each person has a very unique makeup. And the concept here is that unique makeup is based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that we weren't in control of. And then the human being reacts or acts, moves in life based on the circumstance that they find themselves in, also not in our control. We see something, we hear something, taste something, touch something, smell something that's in the circumstance. And we don't have any control over what it is that we see, smell, taste, touch, or hear. And there's a reaction that happens in the body-mind organism based on the circumstance. And that reaction is not something that an individual stops and thinks about how they're going to react. If there is a stopping and then a thinking, how should I react? That is the reaction that's happening based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Not a me doing that, but a happening. Very much like if two chemicals came in contact with each other, each chemical has a specific chemical composition. They come together and there's a reaction based on the chemical composition of the chemicals and the circumstance, the environment they're in. And the reaction is either violent or inert or somewhere in between. And the chemicals don't choose how they react. There's just an impersonal reaction. The human being on a biological and psychological level is essentially the same, much more complex, but the same principle. And the belief in personal doership absolutely doesn't see that. The belief in personal doership says, I'm the doer of this reaction or this response. It's an entity that is fictitious. It's a belief that is not supported when we start to investigate life on a deeper level. And I don't know if you get what I mean. It's really simple. We don't need to become neuroscientists or understand the full working of the body. We just need to understand in broad terms, yes, the body and the human being at any point in time, when I look at it for myself, when I investigate my own experience, the thoughts that I have, the language that I speak, the physical condition I'm in, at any point in time, the things that I like and that I don't like, whether I get angry or afraid in a particular situation, all of those are reactions in the body based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning that was put in place by life, moment after moment after moment, not my doing. I was never in control of that. And so what happens is a happening according to factors, not my doing. And if that's seen, the guilt that we carry around for those things that happened in the past that aren't ideal, the blame that we carry around, the hatred that we carry around for those things that happened in the past that someone else delivered that was painful, all of that can fall away. The load of pride that we carry around falls away. And then with that shift in our belief system, when life unfolds more or less as it has done, where from time to time it's inevitable that we're going to move and perform in a way that delivers pain to others, and inevitable that the other is not going to do what I want all the time. When life continues to unfold like that, without the belief in personal doership, there's no one to hate. It's understood that, yes, life is unfolding, and life is a story, and one way you can look at it, it's my destiny in this moment for there to be pain, and it's the destiny of the other to be the instrument through which the pain is delivered. So then we see we're all in this together, all doing exactly what we're destined to do. The end of a very large part of human suffering. And if we come to see that actually what I am at my core, if life starts allowing us to drop into a place of being, we find even when life is painful, when the other does something that delivers pain and we blame them and we are attached to the outcome, so we feel uncomfortable not only because of the blame but because the outcome isn't what we think is needed. We feel uncomfortable, and then at some point a thought can come up and say, actually, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer. And if that thought arises, the suffering can fall, the circumstance is still more or less the way it is, painful, but we find, there is this place of being where I am, even in the face of pain. Then we start getting our own feedback that says, actually, this belief that my happiness is to be found in outcome, that what I am is added to or subtracted from by circumstance. It's not a belief that's demonstrated by the fact that I can drop into this field of being and find myself complete even in the face of pain. And with that feedback, we might find, oh, here I was, my thinking mind taking hold of a circumstance that essentially is pleasure or pain. The circumstance is only ever pleasure or pain. And here my mind was grabbing hold of the painful circumstance and creating a story about how this pain is an attack on who I am. And that story is my uncomfortableness. And if the working mind starts to understand the different forms of suffering, instead of this suffering being there for days, weeks, months, years, sometimes not being recognized for what it is, going on and on and on, a story about who I believe myself to be, a story that creates an uncomfortableness, a resistance. In an instant, the recognition of it can be, this is suffering, this is an error. What I am is always complete. And that thought can maybe just allow us to drop into being. So I'm sure there's some questions at this point. Can you pass the microphone, please?
Yeah, okay, got it. Shame and guilt arise quite strongly here. Like moments, it's like you're walking along and some memory of something that I've done in the past. Is that okay? And there's these feelings of shame. Mm-hmm. And so I'd obviously like that to stop. Mm-hmm. I'd like the shame to stop, the guilt to stop. It's over really trivial things, like yesterday I was very awkward in a conversation with a neighbour, and afterwards I just thought, what an idiot I am, you know. And so I like what you're saying, and just seeing how would I apply that thinking,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that understanding to meeting that kind of shame.
Okay, it's a very relevant and good question. But in the question we can see something, and so don't feel shame about this, right?
The thinking mind trying to make something.
So the whole talk is pointing out that the thinking mind at its core includes the belief in personal doership. That it can make things happen. And so that ingrained belief says, okay, this sounds interesting, this sounds like what I want, let me ask a question, and the question is, how do I stop feeling shame? So we can start to see, now it's still a great question, but just to see that there's the doer that says, how do I do this? How do I do it? And maybe I didn't spend enough time on the fact that life puts these beliefs in place, the beliefs that I am the doer. And with that belief in place, the shame is forced to arise in some people. It's not an option. It's not your doing. There's a circumstance that happens. So what you mentioned was great. You spoke to a neighbor and you said all these things, and in the end of it, what was happening there? Well, see, so that's part of the flow of life, circumstantial. And the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. Pleasure when it's in line with your biological preferences, pain when it's out of line with your biological preferences. So what happened with the neighbor there, you could say pain in the moment. You didn't articulate what you wanted to articulate correctly. You would have preferred to do it, for it to have happened differently. So we can say pain in the moment. The suffering, the shame is what comes up and says, oh, I'm such a failure. That comes from that ingrained belief in personal doership. Now, that wasn't your doing, but rather life put the beliefs in place, life put the circumstance in place, and therefore the shame arose. So the undoing of those beliefs is also not something you do. You didn't put them in place. You don't undo them. So the question is, so why am I here? Right? One is to hear that suffering is based on the belief in personal doership. And the other is to hear that life brings about change. How does it bring about change? By delivering new conditioning in each moment. The new conditioning can adjust the up-to-date conditioning, sometimes radically. And if the new conditioning adjusts the up-to-date conditioning, what you'll find is you'll find yourself still being awkward with the neighbors. Right? Still pain in the moment. But then the reaction of shame doesn't happen. Now, why does that reaction of shame not happen? Because the belief system has changed. Who changes the belief system?
Totality in some way. The totality in some way. There isn't an individual who's going to...
I would say the words I use is life changes it as a result of delivering new conditioning. And Ramesh used to say, make no mistake, this is simply new conditioning. These talks are life delivering new conditioning. And how it impacts you, how it's received, is not in my control, not in Ramesh's control, and not in your control. So you'll find yourself walking through life tomorrow, and a thought might arise saying, could it be that I've never been the doer? That life has put all of this in place, and that even this thinking is a happening according to my genes and up-to-date. And then you might think, my up-to-date conditioning included being in the talk, hearing all of this, and now this thinking is happening about exactly what was delivered. And at some point we might have this realization, which is not my doing. The realization is simply another thought as a result of a contemplating, which is, you could say, all new conditioning. Each time we have a thought and come to and do some thinking, that becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. At some point we go, I simply cannot be the doer. And this, on one hand that could sound like this is terrible news. I'm not the doer. That means that I can't make life happen a certain way. So to the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 the notion that I'm not the doer sounds terrible. Right? Because, well, who's going to do it then? If it's up to, my neighbor to do it or God to do it for me, well, I'm not very pleased with that. I want to be able to have some control and do it. But when we really hear what's being said and really see and have this insight maybe in a moment, like, I simply cannot be the doer. Right? Not as a story of the thinking mind, but as an actual contemplation and happening, which is happening according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. I simply cannot be the doer. What that means is I simply cannot be guilty. I simply can't blame the other for what is happening, because all of this essentially got put in place at the very beginning. So a deep realization of what is being pointed at here is actually not at all tragic news. It's tragic news to the belief in personal doership. It's tragic news to the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes and the assumption, well, I'm the one that's going to make them happen. But seeing I simply can't be the doer means the cutting of the root from which all the shame arises. The cutting of the root from where the pride and the blame arises. And if we actually even come to see that I've been seeking happiness in pleasure for my whole life, I get pleasure. I've even got those big pleasures, the ones that I was certain is going to be the thing that will give me the happiness I need. I got those in my life, maybe not all of them, but enough to be able to conclude from our own experience, they don't give me continuous unbroken happiness. So then we can start putting a tick next to my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. I've got pleasure and it doesn't give me happiness. And then if we find ourselves actually dropping into being and finding ourselves content and happy and complete, even when there's pain in the moment, then we start to confirm big ticks next to it. My happiness really isn't to be found in pleasure because I find myself at peace even when there's pain, if life starts delivering that experience to us.
Yeah.
And so the doer might not be satisfied with the answer.
I think the doer, well, there's nothing that the doer can do to get rid of the doer, really. It's something that will fall away, or not.
Yeah, and how does it fall away? By life reconditioning the working mind, such that the working mind catches out the thinking mind, which is the doer belief. So that's it. So it can happen. And it doesn't happen just randomly. This story is a story of life, even if it is a spontaneous arising that's just happening now and this is all there is. When we look at what this is, it's undeniable that it still is a story of cause and effect. So it's a spontaneous experience, but when we look at the experience, it's an experience to be an experience of time and space, an experience of cause and effect. So life doesn't just put an oak tree in front of it. It doesn't just have things appear that have no rhyme or reason. Everything that is included in the spontaneous arising of life always unfolds or is there as if it's based on cause and effect. And this change, this spiritual change that happens, also is based on apparent cause and effect. So life puts us in a place where new conditioning is delivered and change happens. I would put forward the notion that you are not the same person that you came in as.
Yeah. Okay.
And what we're speaking about in the whole universe is probably the most relevant set of words and discussion we can have as far as the ending of shame goes.
So remind me again how I'm not the doer.
Good, yeah, it's a fair call. Just because we've spent a lifetime receiving information from the experience tells us there's the feeling of free will in the experience. So the feeling of free will says, I am the doer, it feels like I'm the doer.
Yeah, I chose to come here on this.
Yeah. Then when we look at it, actually the choice is, it happened. There was quite clearly a choice to come versus not to come. So we can't deny that choice happened, but when we look at how the choice happened, The choice happened through a biological instrument that was one way at the time of making the choice, found the circumstance to be one way. If you suddenly got a message from a long-time friend that you haven't seen in 20 years, and it was someone that you truly loved and had so much fun with, and they sent you a message and said, I'm in town, I looked you up, will you come for dinner? Then in that circumstance, the choice may have been different to, I'll go and see Roger some other time.
Yeah.
Because, so in the circumstance, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, a choice was made, but we have to look at that choice and see really it's a result of two factors, plus the circumstance, the genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance. And if the genes and up-to-date conditioning were different or the circumstance was different, it's very viable that the choice would have been different. And so we don't deny that choice is there, because choice is simply the picking of 5 options or 2 options. But whether we call it my choice is a matter of perspective. And as we start to see the mechanics of what happens through the human being, we might start questioning, there is choice, but it's not my choice. Choice happening.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of the number of people I know. I think they could benefit from being here, but they would have no interest in coming. So the interest to come here, well, as you say, will be programmed in some kind of way.
Yeah, exactly. And so Ramesh used to say, in a way, we can call ourselves God's favorites, because here we are on a Friday night, and most people have absolutely no interest in being here on a Friday night.
Yeah.
So what he meant is that if we find ourselves in a situation where life is delivering this new conditioning, no reason to be pessimistic about the notion that I'm not the doer. We actually find I can be optimistic, because with me not being the doer, where do I find myself? In this place where life is throwing out new conditioning that is specifically pertinent for what we're really looking for in life.
Okay, thank you.
It's on. In my Satsang life, sort of recently, I'm hearing that it's good to be in the heart. And I've heard it quite a lot in the recent time. But somehow, sabotage, as much as I know that, I can always find something else to do. So it's like, even though I know that what seems like very strongly, I don't seem to be in control of ever doing it or it happening. And it's coming all the time, like you said it, and that's kind of like the third time this, period of time. And I wonder why that is.
Because you're not the doer.
Yeah. But it does seem funny to know that seems to be really true for me, because every time I hear it, I think, yes, and then I don't do it. Well, not very much. I do it a little bit. But my mind says, well, that's not really enough. If that's the truth and a true place to be, and I'm suffering all the time, why then how do I do that?
The reason is that the up-to-date conditioning has heard that being in the heart is useful, but there's other conditioning that says, it's not really that important. Not really that important. The other conditioning says, actually my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and here I am sitting in the heart, and that's not very conducive for where my happiness is to be found. The other information says your happiness is to be found in the heart.
Yeah.
So what you can start to see is life is now introducing two concepts. We know which one's winning at the moment based on what you've described.
Mm.
But as so you've asked a question about being in the heart, which means the conditioning, even though it's not delivering the actual practice of dropping into being, is somehow there as, yes, this is important. I'm even going to ask a question about it. And I'll say, yes, it's very important. That's where we come to know ourselves. The heart is essentially the opposite of the heart is being in the head. Being in the head, really, when I'm talking about that, is the thinking mind. The thinking mind is guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. And so what takes us out of just sitting quietly is an uncomfortableness in the body, usually, that drives us to do something to distract ourselves. And that uncomfortableness, when we feel it, is one of these forms of suffering. And so we can then conclude, I'm in the head when I'm moving in that direction. When I'm moving to cover up an uncomfortableness, it's actually a movement from an uncomfortableness that, when we look at the story, is a story of guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. And so if that happens, and it starts to be seen that this is the thinking mind ruling the roost. It's the thinking mind that's acting as the general in life, saying, off you go, move in this direction. Then the working mind can kick in. And one of the ways that it started to happen for me is because I was given a sort of suggestion to abide in I am. So
Sorry, to what?
Abide in I am, which is the equivalent of resting in the heart. I am is the essence of consciousness, one of the characteristics of consciousness, being or existence. And it doesn't require it to be thought into existence. It's actually always here. Any human being that is aware of the circumstance, so not aware in any spiritual sense, but just the awareness of my hand, right? That means that consciousness is there. And the nature of consciousness is awareness and the sense of existence. Just being. And so this practice was, whenever awareness and the working mind lands on the fact that there is obsessive thinking in the form of whatever expectation in the future, or guilt or blame, the thought I am can arise. And the thought I am isn't our being, it's a thought, I am. But what's contained in the thought is all of the wisdom that's starting to accumulate about suffering not being helpful, for example, about the understanding of what suffering looks like. And so the thought I am arises and essentially says, stop. It's a reminder that thinking of that nature, if it carries on, is an obstruction of our happiness. And so it comes up and essentially says, stop. Stop and be. Drop. Stop and drop. So the stop is, the thinking mind might say, okay, so this is what happens is we realize that suffering is happening, and then the thinking mind says, stop. Okay, so how am I going to stop? Now, what am I going to do to stop? And that's the thinking mind now taking over. It thinks that it can stop. It can do stopping. So that's more of the thinking mind. And at some point it's registered, stop. That's the only stop that works, is just a complete, it's like freeze. That's what stop means. Stop means freeze. We actually try to do stopping, which is moving. And stop is like mid-sentence, mid-thought. And stop and drop into the heart. And the more that happens, the more you might notice, oh, what a relief, just for a second. Stop, and then we drop into the heart. And this is it's not really a practice, because the stop, the thought I am, which is essentially stop. So for you, you might like to use the word stop or freeze. For me, it was I am. I am included all of that knowing in it. It included stop. It included the understanding that the thinking was suffering and that my happiness is actually the end of suffering. So when that arises, the first time it might happen for half a second. And the thing is, it can happen while you're driving your car. It can happen while you're washing the dishes, while you're at work, while you're talking to a friend even. It doesn't require you to sit and meditate. This is something that can happen while you're just going about your daily living. And you realize it's not really a practice, it's a happening. You don't even do the thought stop. You don't do it, it just up it comes, according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So me talking about it is up-to-date conditioning, and it might start happening. And you'll laugh, you go, oh, I'm not the doer, this is not a practice that I'm doing, this is happening. Why? Because life is bringing about the happening. And so in a day it can happen 20, 25 times and not disturb your day. Like the stop doesn't necessarily mean you have to freeze biologically. It's just a stop of the psychological thinking. And so if it happens 20 times in a day, for the first day, if it happens 20 times, you might find yourself resting in being for really half a second, because the beliefs are, this is not the place, this is pointless, and so the thinking starts again. And we might not realize that the thinking has started again for another 15 minutes. And then awareness lands on it and go, how long have I been thinking about that same subject again? I didn't even notice that I started. And then stop. And, that was 3 or 4 seconds just then. That was maybe half a second again, and we're up in the thinking again. But after you've done it 25 times in a day, not as a practice, so whether it happens 3 times in a day, if it happens twice and someone says, oh, Roger said 25 times and it happened twice, that's the doer, who cares? Like twice is better than none. And then if it happens no times on a day, it's like, oh, it can't be worse than that, none. So what, tomorrow, in that moment, it can't be, stop. Oh, there it happened once today. Just that, if we see the thinking mind beating up about how life should look, then stop. And after a week of this happening, we might find the stopping happens for a second or 2 seconds. And then after 2 weeks, we might find I'm able to stop and be for 5 seconds. At some point, maybe months after this, we might find I'm always stopped and I'm still living life. What that means is I'm always in the heart, and functioning carries on, and this old set of thinking no longer happens. Now the old set of thinking doesn't stop happening because we keep stopping. It's a combination of stopping and an investigation, an inquiry into the different forms of suffering, into what am I really looking for, understanding what I'm looking for is actually not to be found out there. The idea that my happiness is out there is a form of suffering. So when we find ourselves caught up in, do you have a story about what when you're not dropping into being, is there a story about where your happiness is to be found?
Yes, it's in researching to feel well. Researching to feel well.
Okay.
Physically well.
Yeah.
Physically. But can I ask?
Oh, but just before, your happiness won't be found there.
No, but it.
Not in asking, but in the research to feel well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when it happens, you can stop.
I can stop.
Well, just what I'm suggesting is that it's not a bad thing if you suddenly find that thinking about how to feel well, if that were to just stop in a particular moment, it's not a tragedy.
No.
No, it's the opposite of that.
Yes.
So that thinking is the suffering.
Yeah.
It doesn't believe itself to be the suffering. It believes itself to be the salvation. It believes, actually, if I feel well, then that is pleasure, and that's where my happiness is.
Yeah.
So as soon as the working mind registers this, it means that thinking is now at risk. At risk means you're going to stop it, whereas previously there would have been no impulse for it to be stopped.
Yeah.
And when I say you're going to stop it, the working mind is likely to kick up and stop it, not you as a doer.
And if I had the thought happened to sit down and drop into the heart, is that the thinking mind doing that, or is it a working mind?
You have
or doesn't it matter?
It's a good question, because the thinking mind can hijack even this practice, right? And if it does, it'll feel uncomfortable. It won't work. Incidentally, if the thinking mind tries to do stopping, it's
no.
not.
I didn't mean that stopping. I just meant as like a meditation. I didn't mean what you'd said that would happen because it's happening. I meant if I'd understood taking the advice of a teacher and he said put yourself in your heart, and then I actually managed to do that, would that be a thinking?
If you take
or
it
can
on,
it just happen?
If you take it on as a practice and something that you are going to do that will make you happy, that will deliver happiness, then at some point there could be the realization, wow, this is another form of belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and that I can make it happen by dropping into being. So what I'm putting forward here, even if it sounds like a set of prescriptions, I want to make it clear that none of it is a prescription. I'm not prescribing that anyone does anything. Actually, what this is just descriptions of, let's say, what suffering is and what dropping into the heart is. It's not a prescription given to someone to do dropping into the heart. So really it's just a description. Everything that I put forward is a prescription. The doers will hear a prescription like, happiness is the end of suffering. That's a description. Happiness is the end of suffering. The doer will hear it and say, okay, that sounds good, now I'm going to do it. Roger told me to do the end of suffering. No, Roger put forward a description. Suffering, or happiness is the end of suffering. That's the description. What does the doer hear? The doer hears, go and do that. And to the extent that the doer goes to do it, it will be more suffering. Right? But that's okay, because that's a happening. And then hopefully we catch that. When I say we, the working mind that has been programmed, so it catches it and it starts getting cut off. So meditate if you feel like meditating. Meditate if you enjoy it.
Okay, thank you.
If anyone has a meditation practice that is coming from a should and an attachment to outcomes, just be wary of the camera. So So if anyone's got a meditation outcome that is from shoulds and shouldn'ts, maybe awareness will start landing on that and maybe start to see, actually, this is a form of suffering. So once we become aware of what the different forms of suffering is, then that can be very, very useful.
Hi. So effectively, are you saying that basically it's consciousness that is just shining through everything that we do, and it is what it is, and it will be what it is? So accept, surrender.
Yes, one way of looking at it is that I'm not the doer, you're not the doer. So what's happening is a happening according to God's will.
To God's will.
Now, God is not something that a lot of people resonate with. And on the other hand, the word God is something that a lot of people resonate with. I stopped using the word God and would use consciousness or source. And at some point, I felt, no, God's will, I feel like there is a relationship with God, even though there's a clear understanding that there aren't two. So everything is happening according to God's will, for me, works. That's actually how I see it, without believing there is a separate God. So what the concept I would put forward is this, is that before the manifestation, so this moment is what I would call the manifestation. And life has only ever happened in this moment. Our experience of life has always been an experience in this moment. And so this is it at the moment, the manifestation. And the manifestation maybe doesn't have a here and a there. Maybe this is it. This is it. But on the other hand, it appears in experience that there is a here and a there, and a past and a future. So I'm not denying that, I'm not saying past and future doesn't exist. It's sort of, we can be really present with just this, and then question whether there is there a, America and an Australia and an England? Or is there just this? That's one perspective. And the other perspective is that the whole manifestation, including a here and a there, came into existence. But either way, I'd like to see it as a creation that was not there in one moment. In one moment, that we could say consciousness at rest, or source at rest, pure potentiality. And the word potentiality is important because it's not actualized, it's in its potential form, the unmanifest. And potential at some point has to actualize. Otherwise it wouldn't be potential. And so when it actualizes, it turns into this. So absolute nothing becomes everything, becomes this. And so God is, in this concept, absolute nothing. Pure potentiality that explodes into this. So God's will is not the will of some entity that is out there looking in, controlling us, or laughing, or crying. God has become the manifestation. God as energy or consciousness has become all of this, has become the trees and the seas and the birds and the bees and you and me. And everything that happens. So this idea of an external God is not what I'm talking about. So whatever is happening now is a happening according to God's will, as opposed to my will or your will. And when we look at it, not just to take that on as a belief, but when we look at what is happening now, I'm speaking based on the circumstance. So you asked a question, and the speaking is happening based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So God put the genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance in place, or God became that. And so the response is actually part of the whole movement. And then you'll respond. And that will be part of the movement. And if we want to look at it causally, we'll say you responded based on the circumstance and your genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Which which isn't actually mine because there is no me.
Well, it's not yours because you didn't create it. You didn't put your genes and up-to-date conditioning in place. The me that dissolves is the belief in personal doership. It's a phantom entity that projects onto the flow of life an idea of what's going on. So it turns out that the flow of life is always pleasure or pain, and our unhappiness is always an attitude to the flow of life. Mm-hmm. The flow of life is pleasure and pain, and our unhappiness is an attitude to the flow of life. It's not circumstantial. We're not happy because when we're unhappy, it's not because someone has stolen our wallet. Someone stealing our wallet is pain in the moment. We're unhappy because we have a certain attitude to pain in the moment. Mm-hmm. When we're not unhappy because I failed to remember an appointment. Forgetting an appointment is pain in the moment. I'm unhappy because of my relationship to what has happened. So this distinction is very important, that my unhappiness is attitudinal. My happiness is also attitudinal, and it just so happens that it's the attitude of the heart which gets to function when this other attitude of doership falls away. That attitude is not my doing either. It too is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it will be whatever way it is according to how life has conditioned me. And all of that is described as the story of life. That is the way it is. Because Source turned into what is. Source turned into the story. So if we can start to sort of see that the belief in personal doership is not actually as warranted as we might have thought, from some investigations, it starts to fall away. And then our attitude to the flow of life changes.
Okay, thank you.
I was just wondering, with the concept of the thinking mind and the working mind, has your thinking mind dissolved in that sense?
As my thinking mind.
Is that how you would explain what's happened?
Yes. And my working mind is very active.
Some people describe it, they call it like a default neural network in the brain, and it's like the self-referential network, and when we meditate it cuts out and we have the silence, and when we stop meditating it kicks back in. Mm-hmm. But for some people it literally blows out forever. They talk about living ultimately with, well, they might say no thoughts, but often under questioning they say like they have a working mind that will think when they're doing some routine, but generally that referential mind isn't there. And I met someone else who that happened to as well, who said it just blew out 25 years ago. So the brain hears that and goes, sounds nice.
Yeah.
And I mean, but is that the same as you? I mean, you say your working mind's very active. Some people say they live in pure silence. I mean, again, not their doing, but what's your view on all of this? Do you think for some people, their mind just seems to totally blow out? Or
No, I think people describe it inaccurately because their process was one that didn't actually deliver, didn't need to show them exactly what the mechanics are and what's happening. It wasn't important, so they still get to the same place, but they can't necessarily verbalize it very, very well. And they don't need to. That doesn't affect their happiness. Their happiness is there because the thinking mind has stopped. And when I say I've got a very active working mind, at times my working mind stops because it's not needed. So it's very easy for thinking to just subside once circumstance doesn't require the working mind. So when people say there is no person, what on investigation? So when you said on questioning, they'll rephrase it and say, well, okay, yes, it's true that when I'm shopping, the thought does arise. Oh, that's much more expensive than last time, and that's a thought. And if someone says thinking has stopped, what they really mean, we're sloppy with words sometimes. What they really mean is suffering has stopped. So they can say, I can say that for 15 years, the suffering thoughts don't arise. So when we are so something falls away, and how it could be said is that the person has fallen away because there is just thinking happening and no one claiming ownership over it. What claims ownership on it is the doer. And then, what else happens? Even blame is happening, right? So if blame is happening and there's blaming is happening, but there's no one claiming ownership over it, I wouldn't say that that's enlightenment because the blaming is still happening. Now, blaming includes doership in it. So the doer hasn't completely blown up there. But one of the phases, in a sense, which is very positive when it happens because it's doership on the outer level, and actually the outer level can be quite close to the middle. One of the progressions is where suffering arises and there's no one buying into the suffering. So the suffering is witnessed. And I would say that's the phase after realization and before liberation. Liberation is the complete end of suffering. Realization is where the essence of the human being as consciousness has been seen. The realization that there is no one here doing anything, that you could say is part of the realization. And that realization can come about in many different ways. Sometimes the realization is a result of it becoming very clear that this moment is experience. This moment is always an experience, and so when we meditate, it's an experience, and we find the person is different in meditation. The body sense falls away, for example. So if we start looking at each moment as experience, and so in this moment, there's the body and there's thinking and there's the sense of being the person. And then in meditation, we're present with the experience and it becomes clear, where's the body gone? And maybe even that thinking falls away and it becomes very clear that the experience is an experience with nothing personal in it. And yet it's still an experience, an impersonal experience. And so when it becomes clear that it's all experience and the presence of a body, the presence of thinking, and even the presence of the sense, this is my thinking, becomes clear that's all layering of objects on experience to create a certain impression. And so that's why it's said, there is no person. It's really saying there's no fundamentally real person separate from experience. But once that's seen, the experience of the person actually remains. We just know that it's now, there's a knowing, it's experience. So this idea that there is no person, to me what's really saying is there is no doer, It's been seen that there is no doer. And once that's seen, you could say, well, there was a total collapse. Now, what's this total collapse? It's a total collapse of the doer. The experience is still that, well, I'm sitting on a chair, and the experience is that Roger is here and he's separate from everyone else. And so, I think we have to be wary about some of these descriptions about what we're looking for. To be frank, from my experience, that awakening experience where the person falls away, that happened, and thankfully, because I came across Ramesh, the beliefs about the significance of that, which was in place, got sort of refined and eventually fell away, and allowed a progression to happen, a progression that meant living life as Roger, still with that realization having happened, but not believing that what's most important is a oneness experience. I'm not interested in a oneness experience, I'm interested in the peace, the continuous unbroken peace of mind. And so if that peace of mind is available without a oneness experience, I'm still very happy. If we think that we're looking for a oneness experience and we don't realize that actually it's the peace that's most important, then something fundamental still hasn't clicked. And so what will happen is there'll be expectation waiting for the oneness experience to remain, the oneness experience to be there. And who wants a oneness experience? Come on, there must be some hands. We want a oneness experience because we've heard that this oneness experience is enlightenment. And maybe we don't even know what enlightenment is, but we think it's better than this. It's going to be better than this. Essentially, I'll be happy. So why not just be clear on what human happiness is? And let's focus on that. And from my experience, having gone through all of that, it turns out that what gets delivered is human happiness in a very simple form. Human happiness in the form of the absence of suffering, not in the form of a oneness experience, not in the form of the complete obliteration of the person. Because otherwise, and the funny thing is, we listen to these teachings, because in the teachings, this is not a criticism of the teachings. This is actually pointing at the hilarity of life. Right? There's a man talking to us and telling us that there's no one here, right? And then we imagine what's happening on the other side there. Right? And it's a teaching, it's there to do something, it's very powerful. But at some point, we also need to question whether it's exactly true that there is no one here. There's no doer. There's no doer. But the experience of an individual, the experience of the individual is there. So we can say there is a person, or there is the experience of a person. As long as what we're being clear on is there isn't the person that I believe to be there, which essentially is the doer. And so Ramesh used to say, look, the ego doesn't die. The ego remains. The ego will always be there. And so what he meant by the ego means it was the person. And what he meant by person is impersonal consciousness of source, linked to a particular body-mind organism and functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. So the person is the combination of impersonal consciousness, the body, and the experience of personal consciousness. And that will never die until the body dies. When the body dies, then that dies. So Ramana was an ego. Jesus was an ego. Ramesh was an ego. The difference is that before enlightenment, there was an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, seeking pleasure, seeking happiness in pleasure, blaming, feeling guilty, having worry and anxiety. And after enlightenment, there's still the human being, but now without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And that, to me, is a more accurate way of describing it. But accuracy is not important in all teachings. So remember, I'm not saying this teaching is right and others are wrong. To me, a teaching is a methodology to undo errors, and an error can be undone in many different ways. And so if a different teaching says something different, my response is, why is it saying that? As in, not why it shouldn't be, but why, what error is it trying to undo, and what methodology is it using to undo it? So there's an appreciation for all the different teachings, not a criticism of them.
You say that, but a lot of people's minds interpret teachings in different ways. And you could say not their doing, but there's a lot of harm, I think, on the spiritual circuit to various teachings. Not yours, in my opinion, not so much yourself. But how our minds interpret the messages can be rather damaging. I just want to maybe follow up a little bit on the brain. I think, I don't know where I am, maybe I'm somewhere in the middle still, and there is a lot of witnessing of the sufferer and the doing, and a lot of it's seen through. I guess part of the brain, or the working mind, is still asking that kind of question, well, you know, how to dissolve that illusion of self. So I just feel it's working, that something's happening subconsciously maybe, or unconsciously. That there is this working, just something's happening there, trying to work that out. Is that what's happening for everyone, do you think?
Well, if contemplating happens, so contemplation about, okay, let's say, is what I'm looking for happiness? And we'll say, let's for a while say it's happiness. So this guy, and Roger's suggesting that happiness is not to be found in outcomes, is to be found in the absence of suffering. So let me look at suffering. So this is all something that might have already happened, right? And that contemplating is the working mind. That's useful contemplating. And it brings about change. And that's what the feedback I get so often, and my experience is that the magic of this is not what happens in satsang here. As far as satsangs go, this is probably the one that will give you the least bells and whistles feeling inside. But what hopefully does happen is you leave with a whole lot of new conditioning, that as you find yourself going through life in the next weeks, the new conditioning starts functioning and starts recognizing the human unhappiness that has been habitually there, that hasn't been recognized for what it is because the information hasn't been given to the working mind. And not only does it recognize it, but it starts cutting it off. And when the thinking mind starts getting cut off by the working mind, what we find is peace. And so even though there's no one doing it, it's happening. And at some point you might look back and say, wow, the last 3 weeks there's been no suffering. Or the last 3 weeks my suffering has been cut off quicker and quicker and quicker, which really means that the understanding is going deeper and deeper and deeper. So it starts off as an intellectual understanding, and as we see it, which really means as seeing happens in the course of daily living, every time something is seen, this is pain in the moment, this is pleasure in the moment, this is blame, and it's my attitude to what's happening in the flow of life. Every time that's seen and we put another tick next to the concept, meaning it becomes more known for ourselves, that means the understanding goes deeper, which means the suffering gets cut off quicker and quicker.
Can you own everything you do in your life? Is it like you do good deeds and someone goes, "That was great, Roger," and you go, "Not my doing."
Yeah,
Do you
sure.
you just live normally? I'm sure.
Yeah, because at some point we understand deeply what life is. So I know it's not my doing, and so if I say thank you, which I do, thank you to me doesn't mean claiming ownership over it. I apologize for things that happen through me that deliver pain, right? Apologizing doesn't mean forgetting that there is no doer. It actually is the recognition that yes, it was destiny for pain to be delivered to the other through the actions, which also means probably pain for me, and it's destined for me to say, I'm sorry, it wasn't my intention to hurt you. Knowing that there's no doer, and someone says, well, if there's no doer, why would you apologize? And I said, it's the biological entity that's apologizing, the same biological entity that functioned. And the guilt and shame isn't there. The guilt and shame is the part that would have arisen had the doer been there. And the fact is that we have to live life as if we are the doers. Society will punish us for those actions that deliver pain to society, and they'll reward us for those actions that deliver pleasure to society. So knowing we're not the doer doesn't absolve us of responsibility to society, but with the deep understanding that we aren't the doer, we know that for ourselves, we'll receive the pleasure and pain that society gives us, we'll enjoy the pleasure and endure the pain, but without that extra load of guilt, blame or pride.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think we're sort of coming to the end of tonight. There's a whole 2 more days for those people who are game. We'll go into things in a lot more detail over the next 2 days. And in essence, it's just more of the same, more new conditioning that hopefully, not in our control, brings about change, and then we find ourselves simply and effortlessly living life differently. Thank you.